Today we're going to talk about Daniel Martell. Now, there are two little children missing in Nova Scotia, and he's their stepfather. Greg, tell us about the videos we're going to watch.
Yeah, Canadian siblings Lily Sullivan and Jack Sullivan, 6 and 4, disappeared from their rural home in Nova Scotia on May 2nd. There's been a lot of searches, a lot of things going on. This guy's done a lot of interviews in front of the camera, many of them very small and very short. This is about a 12-minute video we're going to watch that's been cut up into pieces with the pertinent pieces.
Every day when I wake up, it feels like I'm reliving a nightmare of May 2nd. But the main feelings from sadness have just turned to anger because there's no evidence as of after 1 month. And it's really taken a toll.
Case closed?
It should be case closed. It should have been case closed from the very start. Because with the amount of resources and technology and the amount of searchers and everyone deployed in that first initial search, that was a lot. That was an 8-kilometer radius outwards. I know for 100% they won't find anything. I mean, that's probably why they waited this long to do it. Just keep the public informed, I guess, that they're hard at work.
Why would a stepfather smile when police bring dogs to search for his missing children? 5 months after Lily and Jack Sullivan disappeared, Daniel Martell faced the cameras with a grin and said, "They won't find anything." His calm was unsettling, his certainty absolute. Meanwhile, their mother Malaya vanished from sight, leaving behind one haunting line: "I just want them home." 2 parents, 2 reactions. One too controlled, one too broken. What really hides behind the smile of a man who claims to know the ending before it's even written? By the time September 2025 arrived, the case of Lily and Jack Sullivan had long faded from the daily headlines. It had been 5 months since the children vanished from their small rural home on Gerlach Road in Nova Scotia. The initial search had ended without answers, leaving only unanswered questions and an uncomfortable quiet. Then, suddenly, the silence broke. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police returned to the property not with volunteers and drones this time, but with cadaver dogs trained to locate human remains. The announcement shocked the community. The word, cadaver, carried a weight that no one wanted to face. For months, their hope had been that Lily and Jack were lost somewhere, hidden, perhaps even taken. But dogs that hunt for the scent of death changed the tone of an investigation. When reporters gathered outside the property, everyone expected tears, or perhaps panic, from the stepfather at the center of the case. What they saw instead was something far more unsettling. Daniel Martell stood before the cameras, his posture upright, his hands loosely clasped at his waist. He wasn't trembling or avoiding eye contact. He spoke evenly, with a calmness that bordered on confidence. "I know 100% they won't find anything," he said, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The words were definitive, too definitive. His certainty didn't come from faith. It came from knowledge. As the interview continued, small details in his behavior began to reveal themselves. His voice remained low and deliberate, every syllable measured. There was no break, no crack, no hint of a man overwhelmed by grief or fear. He did not blink for long stretches, a sign of focus so intense it felt manufactured. The stillness of his face suggested control, not composure. When asked what he thought of the police's renewed efforts, Daniel gave a small smile and said he was actually happy about the dogs. "They've been busy," he added, almost cheerfully, "and I've been asking for this for 3 months." Then came the moment that froze viewers across the country, a quick half smile, the corners of his mouth lifting only slightly. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but experts in behavioral analysis would later call it a micro-duper's delight. A fleeting flash of satisfaction that can emerge when a person feels they've outsmarted someone or regained control of a situation. This smile was not relief, it was ownership. Throughout the segment, Daniel's tone remained steady, but his phrasing grew increasingly technical. He spoke about the search methods: drones, ATVs, specialized teams, as if reading from a procedural manual. Not once did he mention Lily or Jack by name. He did not refer to them as my kids, or the little ones. Instead, they became the children, the case, the search. The distance in his language mirrored the distance in his body. Where grief often folds a person inward, shoulders hunched, hands drawn close to the chest, Daniel expanded outward, arms loose, stance wide, occupying space as though asserting authority. Body language experts describe this contrast as emotional detachment. The human body tends to betray sorrow through contraction. People shrink, clutch, or self-soothe when confronted with trauma. A grieving parent often crosses their arms, rubs their hands together, or lowers their gaze. Daniel did none of these things. His chest remained open, his chin elevated, and his gaze fixed directly on the interviewer's eyes. When the subject of finding the bodies arose, his pupils did not dilate, and his breathing did not change. It was as if the phrase meant nothing to him. Yet the absence of distress does not necessarily indicate guilt. It can mean many things: shock, denial, exhaustion, or simply a different emotional processing style. But what made Daniel's demeanor troubling was its consistency. Over months of appearances, his effect never shifted. No visible grief, no visible anger, no fatigue. Even his pauses seemed rehearsed, evenly spaced to project rationality. For someone whose stepchildren were still missing, his equilibrium was unnervingly perfect. When the segment aired, public reaction was instant and polarized. Some viewers praised his composure. "He's being strong." One comment read, "He's keeping it together for his family." Others saw something far darker. "That's not calm, that's cold." Online forums dissected every micro movement, the stiffness of his jaw, the direction of his gaze, the momentary smirk. Investigators call this phenomenon behavioral leakage, the subconscious release of emotion or intent through minor physical cues. Daniel's lack of eye aversion was particularly striking. Most people, when discussing distressing events, glance away as their mind accesses emotional memory. He did not. His eyes locked forward, as though tethered to an invisible line. Combined with his steady voice and minimal gesturing, this created what analysts call a controlled demeanor, a performance of calm designed to appear rational, but often serving to suppress inner chaos. When compared with known patterns of authentic grief, the difference becomes stark. Genuine anguish manifests in asymmetric facial expressions, one eyebrow rising higher than the other, tears produced unevenly, muscles trembling without coordination. Daniel's face, by contrast, was symmetrical and motionless. Where a mourning parent's voice tends to waver unpredictably, his speech followed an even cadence. The more he controlled his body, the more unnatural the image became. What truly unsettled experts, however, was the timing of his emotion. He smiled while mentioning the dogs, frowned only when speaking of social media attacks, and showed irritation when asked about the investigation's direction. His effect aligned not with the tragedy, but with his personal reputation. The emotional energy in his voice rose when defending himself, not when describing the children. If calmness were innocence, Daniel would appear blameless. But this kind of calm often belongs to those who need to manage perception. It is self-protection disguised as poise. The more he emphasized control, the more he revealed its necessity. At the end of the interview, the reporter asked whether he still believed the children were alive. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, his first visible break in rhythm, then replied, "Yes. I hope so. That's all we have, hope." The phrase should have carried weight, but it landed hollow. His lips pressed together afterward, a micro gesture known as lip compression, often signaling withheld information or suppressed emotion. As the camera pulled back, the frame captured Daniel alone, standing in the fading light beside the tree line where the search dogs had just begun to sniff. Behind him stretched the forest, dense, silent, and still untouched by answers. In that moment, his serenity no longer looked like strength. It looked like distance. Forensic psychologists reviewing the footage later agreed on one point: the calmness was not confidence, it was control. It was the control of a man who needed to command the narrative, to manage what others saw, and to maintain composure so absolute that no one could glimpse what lay beneath. But silence, no matter how disciplined, cannot outlast truth. 5 months after Lily and Jack disappeared, Daniel Martell had learned how to hold still. The question now was whether he could hold the truth as tightly. The story of Lily and Jack Sullivan's disappearance unfolds not as a straight line, but as a series of fragment statements, press clips, and brief public appearances that together form a picture of confusion, contradiction, and control. Between May and September of 2025, the investigation passed through several distinct phases, each marked by new inconsistencies in the parents' behavior and words. When viewed as one continuous narrative, the transformation of both Daniel Martell and Malaya Brooks Murray becomes clearer not through what they said, but through how they moved, how they looked, and how their bodies betrayed their minds. May 2, 2025, the day everything began. 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Jack reportedly vanished from their home on Gerlach Road, a quiet stretch of forest and farmland near Lansdowne Station, Nova Scotia. According to official reports, the 911 call came from the children's mother, Malaya. Her voice, captured on dispatch logs, was described as composed but distressed. She told authorities that the sliding door at the back of the house had been left open, and that her children were playing one moment and gone the next. It was this phrase, "gone the next," that investigators would later scrutinize. From the very beginning, Daniel's account conflicted subtly with hers. He claimed that as soon as they noticed the children were gone, he jumped in his vehicle instantly, driving through back roads and surveying culverts and ditches while waiting for police to arrive. The language was assertive, almost cinematic. He placed himself in motion immediately, the hero of his own narrative. Malaya's description, by contrast, was passive and dreamlike. "We woke up," she said, "and I heard them playing in the next room." Her focus wasn't on the moment of disappearance, but on the morning's calm, a mother drifting between sleep and waking. May 6, 2025, after 4 days of intensive searching by RCMP ground crews, volunteers, and air units, the official effort was scaled back. No trace of the children was found, no footprints, no clothing, no scent trail for the dogs to follow. In most missing child cases, the early days are filled with public pleas, parents appearing together, hands clasped, eyes swollen, begging for information. But Daniel and Malaya retreated from view. Their absence created a vacuum that the public quickly filled with speculation. Why were they silent? Why no press conference, no candlelight vigil led by the family themselves? June 2025, the investigation turned inward. Detectives began focusing on inconsistencies in the couple's statements. Daniel voluntarily took a polygraph test and later claimed he had passed. His phone and Malaya's were seized for digital forensics, a standard procedure in such cases, but one that often signals a shift from rescue to inquiry. During this period, Daniel made his first recorded appearance on a local YouTube channel dedicated to community missing person coverage. Viewers immediately noted his physical presentation. He sat upright, shoulders squared, chin slightly elevated, a posture of dominance defense. His arms were crossed at the abdomen, not tightly but deliberately, a gesture of both control and self-barrier. The crossing of arms in body language can mean protection, but when paired with a raised chin and steady gaze, it becomes something else: the authority. He was not shielding himself from grief, he was containing it, reshaping it into composure. Each sentence began with "I," emphasizing agency, action, and strength. Malaya, appearing briefly beside him, displayed the opposite energy. Her hands were clasped, knuckles pale, held close to her chest. Her shoulders slumped inward, and her gaze rarely lifted from the ground. She nodded frequently, almost excessively, as Daniel spoke, a nonverbal signal of submission or agreement, common in individuals who feel dominated in conversation. Where Daniel expanded into space, she diminished within it. This contrast between them was striking, as if one person was performing certainty while the other quietly bore its cost. September 2025, the case reached a grim milestone. After months with no progress, RCMP returned to the property with cadaver dogs, trained to detect human remains. The announcement reignited public scrutiny and brought the family back into the spotlight. Daniel stood outside his home once again, calm and composed, insisting, "I know 100% they won't find anything." His voice remained steady, even proud. The phrase, "they won't find anything," became more than a statement, it was a psychological wall. By this point, body language experts and online investigators had accumulated enough footage to track Daniel's physical consistency. In every clip, his face stayed expressionless, his shoulders squared, his head tilted slightly upward, giving the impression of superiority or defiance. This was not the posture of despair, but of defense. In his calmness, there was calculation. Every movement, every breath seemed controlled. When speaking about police, he leaned forward. When the children were mentioned, he leaned back. The body, more than words, revealed what he wanted to avoid. Malaya, on the other hand, had disappeared from the media entirely by late summer. Her absence spoke louder than any statement. When she finally resurfaced in a single brief interview weeks later, she seemed smaller, her frame hunched, her voice nearly a whisper. The guilt posture was unmistakable, hands wringing together, fingers interlocked in repetitive motions, shoulders rounded forward. Behavioral psychologists interpret this as self-punishment or fear posture, common among individuals experiencing intense shame, coercion, or emotional exhaustion. Together, their body language told two opposing stories that still managed to align in function. Daniel's dominance defense projected control, while Malaya's guilt posture suggested surrender. Both, however, served the same psychological purpose: to protect the self from collapse. Where a grieving parent might display open vulnerability, hands to the chest, eyes searching, speech trembling, these two presented an inversion of mourning. They didn't break down, they built barriers. The reconstructed timeline doesn't simply recount dates, it maps a gradual emotional transformation. May, shock masked by procedure. June, control and composure as investigative scrutiny grew. September, polished certainty in the face of potential discovery. In every stage, Daniel and Malaya moved further from the raw emotion expected of loss. Their public appearances felt like rehearsals rather than reactions. The few times emotion surfaced, it appeared misaligned: a smile at an inappropriate moment, a misplaced "we," a voice too calm for the gravity of missing children. This contrast, one partner over-controlling, the other collapsing inward, became the visual signature of the Sullivan case. It wasn't what they said that disturbed observers, it was the way they inhabited the silence between their words. Daniel's calmness carried an undercurrent of defiance, while Malaya's fragility whispered of fear. Both responses were unnatural, inverted mirrors of what the situation demanded. As investigators pieced together the timeline, one conclusion became difficult to ignore. Whether through guilt, trauma, or a deeper secret, both adults seemed to have stepped out of sync with the emotional reality of two missing children. Their behaviors did not mirror the chaos of uncertainty. Instead, they synchronized into an eerie equilibrium, one of control and surrender. In missing person investigations, silence can mean many things: grief, shock, or guilt. In the case of Daniel Martell and Malaya Brooks Murray, 5 months of silence had crystallized into something else entirely, a language of its own. Daniel's posture declared, "I am in control." Malaya's posture pleaded, "I am afraid." And yet, both told the same unspoken truth. They were not acting like people who had lost their children. They were acting like people trying not to lose control. When the cameras found Daniel Martell, what they captured was not chaos or despair, it was precision. Every movement, every breath, every blink was measured. In the world of behavioral psychology, control at this level is rarely accidental. It is either training, or it is suppression. The first thing that stood out across Daniel's interviews was what he didn't say. He spoke of the children, the kids, or the situation, but never once did he use their names, Lily or Jack. This omission might seem trivial, but language carries weight. In cases of grief, parents often cling to the intimacy of a name. It keeps the lost close. Avoiding names is a classic marker of emotional distancing, an unconscious strategy for preventing further pain or for separating oneself from guilt. Each time he replaced Lily or Jack with the kids, it created a buffer, a linguistic barrier between himself and the reality of their disappearance. It was as if saying their names would bring him too close to something he didn't want to feel or something he already knew. Daniel's hands told another story. During nearly every public appearance, his fingers were interlocked between his knees, pressed tightly together. It was not a relaxed gesture. The thumbs locked, knuckles white, the motion small but constant, a subtle forward rock of the hands or a tightening of the grip. To a trained observer, this is a suppression signal. The body attempts to control its own agitation by creating physical resistance. as if to hold an energy that threatens to escape. In psychological terms, it is somatic containment. The nervous system tries to manage emotion through muscle tension. People who are genuinely grieving tend to reach outward, touching photos, clasping tissues, gesturing toward the person they miss. Daniel's body instead folded inward at the core, energy compressed into restraint. That restraint extended to his voice. When speaking to reporters, Daniel displayed a low, deliberate cadence, a rhythm more suited to a police briefing than a plea for help. His tone rarely shifted, no matter the question. When asked about the children, his speech became factual, procedural. They used drones, ATVs, helicopters. He explained, listing each tool with the calm of a logistics officer. The more emotional the topic, the more technical his response became. This is known as intellectualization defense, a psychological strategy in which the speaker replaces feelings with facts to avoid vulnerability. By reciting technology and procedure, Daniel moved the conversation away from grief and toward control. It allowed him to perform cooperation while maintaining distance from emotion. In one particularly telling clip, his eyes flicked briefly upward as he listed the search tools, then settled forward again when finished, his microgesture signaling completion, as though checking off a task rather than recalling a nightmare. The moment that crystallized this strange composure came when he was asked about the Cadaver dogs searching his property. Most parents would flinch at the suggestion that their missing children might be dead. Daniel smiled. "I'm actually happy about that," he said. The words hung in the air, an incongruent effect, meaning a mismatch between situation and emotion. The muscles around his mouth lifted, but his eyes did not move. There was no grief, no pain, no fear, only satisfaction that the search was finally happening. He then added, almost proudly, "I've been asking for them for 3 months." This brief smile, a fraction of a second, was what behavioral analysts later called a micro-duper's delight, a flash of gratification sometimes observed when a person believes they've regained control over a narrative. It wasn't joy, it was relief at mastery. The incongruity of that moment, the pleasure of a search that implies death, was so sharp that even casual viewers noticed. His calmness no longer looked like strength, it looked like detachment. But the most unsettling phrase of all came unprompted. In the middle of one interview, without being asked, Daniel said, "We didn't kill the kids." No one had accused him of killing them in that moment. There had been no question phrased that way. This kind of preemptive denial cue often appears when a person's internal dialogue leaks into external speech. It's an attempt to silence an unspoken accusation, to answer a question no one has yet voiced aloud. Linguistically, it betrays forethought. Psychologically, it signals an awareness of suspicion and a subconscious need to get ahead of it. When the behavior panel, a team of 4 former law enforcement and behavioral experts, reviewed Daniel's footage, they were divided on whether he was lying, but united on one conclusion: his demeanor was not grief. His composure is not deception, it's disassociation. One panelist concluded, "Disassociation is the mind's way of detaching from intolerable stress. It manifests as emotional flatness, a sense of being outside one's own body. People who disassociate often appear calm, logical, even robotic. Their nervous systems shut down the emotional centers of the brain to survive trauma or to manage knowledge too heavy to carry consciously." Daniel's body confirmed this reading. When he declared, "I know 100% they won't find anything," a micro-expression flashed across his face, a quick tightening of the upper lip and a slight narrowing of the eyes. This combination, known as aggressive certainty, signals a person who is reinforcing their own belief under pressure. It is the physical manifestation of insistence. The lips compress to prevent doubt from escaping, while the eyes narrow as if to focus the conviction inward. The sentence itself, "I know 100%, is absolute, unyielding, leaving no space for uncertainty. People who truly hope often say, "I don't think they'll find anything." People who know speak like Daniel. Even his breathing betrayed calculation. In one segment, as he finished a sentence, his chest barely rose. He was controlling oxygen intake, micro-managing physiological reactions the way one might control a performance. Suppressing breath can minimize tremors in the voice, preventing the emotional quiver that exposes vulnerability. It was the act of a man who refused to let his body reveal what his mind wouldn't admit. Every frame of Daniel's appearances reflected the same paradox: outward calm, inward tension. His words built a wall of logic, his body a cage of restraint. The lack of visible grief was not proof of guilt, but it was proof of something: a man either protecting himself from unbearable truth or mastering a narrative he no longer believed. The absence of Lily and Jack hung in the silence after each of his sentences, their names missing as deliberately as his tears. In their place stood facts, lists, and controlled breath. What Daniel Martell revealed through his body language was not a lack of care, but a transformation of emotion into control. Whether that control was born of innocence or fear remains the question, but his body, more than his words, whispered the answer. This was not a father searching for children. This was a man fighting to contain himself. When Malaya Brooks Murray finally appeared before the camera, months after her children's disappearance, her presence felt like a whisper. Her voice was fragile, her movements hesitant, as though each word required permission to exist. If Daniel Martell embodied control, Malaya embodied collapse. Her body and speech were out of sync, the face of a woman who had not slept, the posture of someone who carried both grief and fear. From the first second of her interview, a single gesture revealed her emotional truth. When she said softly, "I want them home," her head bowed forward, eyes cast downward. It was not a rehearsed motion, it was instinctive. That downward tilt is the posture of sincere sadness, not defensive or manipulative, but genuine despair. It exposes the nape of the neck, a vulnerable position that humans instinctively avoid when they feel threatened. In grief, however, vulnerability returns as surrender. For that brief moment, Malaya's body aligned with emotion. She looked and sounded like a mother longing for her children. But the illusion of openness faltered the moment Daniel's name entered the conversation. When asked to describe what happened that morning, Malaya's eyes shifted sharply to her left, away from the interviewer, away from the camera. In behavioral analysis, a leftward eye movement, particularly during emotionally charged subjects, often signals avoidance. It may indicate discomfort, an unwillingness to access certain memories, or fear of contradiction. The timing was exact. Every time she said, "Daniel," or "my partner," her gaze broke from contact, her voice softened, and her breathing quickened. It was as if his name alone carried weight she could not bear. Her choice of words deepened the pattern. Throughout the entire interview, Malaya used the pronoun "wa" more than 15 times, while the word "I" appeared only in moments of routine or necessity. "I called 911. I was sleeping. I just had the instinct." The dominance of "we" over "I" is a textbook case of diffusion of responsibility. It's the linguistic equivalent of sharing blame before blame is ever assigned. People under control, whether by fear, guilt, or manipulation, often merge themselves into the plural to escape singular accountability. By saying, "We woke up," "We didn't hear the door," and "We were looking," Malaya erased herself as an individual. It wasn't her story, it was their story, rehearsed and unified. Her vocabulary, too, carried the fingerprints of persuasion rather than description. Words like "instantly," "just," and "maybe" appeared repeatedly. "I instantly called. They just got out the sliding door. Maybe they wandered off." These are not sensory details, they are persuasive modifiers, designed to guide belief rather than convey experience. When a person recounts genuine memory, they tend to include concrete imagery, what they saw, heard, felt. Persuasive language, by contrast, seeks to convince. It rushes the listener past the gaps with urgency, instantly, removes time, just, minimizes significance, maybe, grants flexibility. Each word helps smooth the narrative, covering seams in the truth with emotionless polish. The most revealing phrase came when she said, "Last night was one of the worst nights because I didn't have them in their beds." Linguistically, this sentence centers on herself, not her children. A grieving mother might say, "Because they weren't in their beds," focusing on the absence of the children. But Malaya said, "I didn't have them," positioning the pain as something happening to her, not to them. The emotional spotlight remains internal. Her sorrow is real, but its focus is self-directed, a form of self-protective grief. Behavioral analysts note that this phrasing often appears when guilt and loss coexist. The speaker experiences themselves as the victim, even within their own tragedy. Observers from the behavior panel, who later analyzed her footage, summarized it succinctly: she fears judgment more than deception. Her eyes, her posture, her tone, everything about her communication signaled anxiety about how she was being perceived. It wasn't the fear of being caught in a lie, it was the fear of being seen as a bad mother. When asked about the Amber Alert not being issued, her voice cracked, not from anger at the authorities, but from embarrassment that people might think she hadn't done enough. Her shoulders lifted toward her ears, a protective barrier, as if bracing for verbal blows. The experts from Never a Truer Word went further. After dissecting her word choices, they proposed that Malaya might have been coerced into narrative alignment, what they called forced co-authorship. Her overuse of we, her inconsistencies in timeline, and her avoidance cues around Daniel all suggested she wasn't fully in control of her story. They speculated 3 possible influences: addiction, which narrows emotional range and amplifies self-focus; depression, which dulls clarity and temporal awareness; or psychological control, in which a dominant partner directs not only behavior but language. In all 3 scenarios, the result is the same: speech becomes survival, not expression. Her hands betrayed this inner conflict more clearly than her words ever could. Throughout her interview, Malaya repeatedly touched her collarbone and neckline, fingers brushing the skin just below her throat. At other times, she pulled her thumb into her palm, enclosing it tightly with her fingers. These gestures are known as comfort-seeking signals, unconscious attempts to self-soothe under stress. The throat touch protects one of the body's most vulnerable areas, a reflex linked to fear and submission. The thumb grip, meanwhile, is a childlike gesture, a way of holding oneself when physical comfort from others is absent. In both cases, her body was telling the story her words couldn't. She was frightened, contained, and deeply insecure about the ground beneath her. The rhythm of her voice reinforced that vulnerability. Unlike Daniel's monotone control, Malaya's speech fluttered with hesitations, soft repetitions, and uneven pacing. She often began sentences with "and" or "so," as if stitching fragments together in real time. Her breathing was shallow, lips trembling slightly before certain words. When describing the morning her children disappeared, she stumbled between past and present tense. They were playing, they are so sweet, they will talk to anyone. This tense confusion indicates the mind struggling to process trauma, partly stuck in the past, partly refusing to accept it as past at all. Yet even within that confusion, traces of suppression emerged. When she mentioned Daniel directly, her lips pressed together in a brief line, forming a micro-compression, a signal of withheld information or the suppression of disagreement. Each time she reasserted unity. We were together. We did everything we could. Her body contradicted her. The neck tightened, shoulders curved inward, and the hands closed tighter. The language said team, but the posture said fear. In behavioral profiling, congruence between words and gestures is the hallmark of truth. When they diverge, something beneath the surface demands protection. Malaya's body language and speech never fully aligned. Her sorrow appeared real, but her cooperation felt coerced. She looked like someone performing a story she didn't entirely believe but couldn't risk refusing to tell. Her interview ended quietly. The camera lingered as she glanced down again, exhaling through parted lips. No tears came, only fatigue. The last image of her fingers fidgeting at her neckline, the thumb once more tucked into her palm, captured the essence of her state, a woman trapped between grief and fear, trying to stay small enough to survive both. If Daniel's posture was a fortress, Malaya's was a confession. She didn't need to lie. Her silence was already an admission. In the end, her body spoke the truth more eloquently than any words could. She was terrified, not of the public, not even of the investigation, but of the man whose name made her eyes turn away. When analysts began comparing Daniel Martell's and Malaya Brooks Murray's interviews, what emerged was not simply a pair of parallel accounts. It was a shared linguistic blueprint, almost as if the two had rehearsed from the same script. The similarities between their phrasing went beyond coincidence. They reflected a deliberate alignment of memory, emotion, and control. In linguistic forensics, this pattern is known as constructed alibi syntax. It appears when multiple speakers unconsciously or intentionally adopt identical phrasing to maintain a cohesive version of events, smoothing out the cracks that might otherwise expose the truth. Across every statement, three key expressions reappeared. The first was, "We noticed," used by both, which indicated a shared narrative, showing joint storytelling rather than individual recollection. The second was, "Immediately," or "instantly," also used by both, representing a linguistic attempt to cover or compress time gaps between discovery and reaction. The third was, "Surveyed," or "looked everywhere," again used by both, which reflected generalized language designed to sound thorough without providing verifiable detail. Each of these phrases tells us something subtle but important. "We noticed" does not describe what either one felt or saw. It presents awareness as a joint act, preempting questions about responsibility. A mother might naturally say, "I realized they were gone." A father might say, "I couldn't find them." But "we noticed" spreads accountability across both, implying a partnership even in confusion. It is the language of unity, but unity can also be the language of coordination. When people share the same guilt or the same fear, they often speak in "wis." The word, "immediately," carries its own weight. It appears in both Daniel's and Malaya's accounts, sometimes in duplicate. "I immediately jumped in my vehicle." "I instantly started searching." At first glance, it seems like urgency, the behavior of caring parents reacting fast. But psychologically, the overuse of "immediate" often signals a need to prove speed rather than recall it. Real memory doesn't include timestamps, invented memory does. By emphasizing instant reaction, the speaker tries to erase any pause that might suggest hesitation, confusion, or a decision made in delay. It's a subtle form of temporal editing, meant to cover a gap that might hold something incriminating or shameful. Then there is "surveyed," Daniel's chosen word when describing how he searched the nearby dirt roads and culverts. The term sounds official, efficient, rational, but "surveyed" is observational, not active. It implies standing at a distance, looking rather than physically searching. Malaya mirrored this tone when she said they were looking everywhere. Not running, not calling, not searching through, just looking. It's an abstraction of action, the language of someone describing what a search should look like, not what it truly felt like. These neutral verbs distance the speaker from emotional reality, transforming chaos into procedure. Linguistic experts describe such phrasing as part of a control narrative, the effort to maintain order through rational diction. Emotionally authentic accounts of trauma are rarely tidy. They are filled with sensory language. "I screamed. I couldn't breathe. I ran through the mud." But Daniel and Malaya's speech lacked those elements. Their sentences were clean, symmetrical, and emotionally muted. The result was not the sound of chaos, but the echo of control. One motif in their speech captured this perfectly: sound and silence. Malaya told reporters, "I heard them playing. Then it was quiet." Daniel, in his own interview, said, "It was too quiet." These two lines mirror each other like reflections, forming a single emotional arc. In Malaya's version, there is a gentle domesticity, the sound of children playing, life in motion followed by abrupt quiet. In Daniel's, the quiet becomes an emphasis, almost an accusation. Together, they create a symbolic transition from noise to silence, from life to absence. The repetition of quietness across both accounts suggests a shared memory, but also a shared need to define the disappearance as something that simply happened, a moment when sound stopped, rather than an event that someone caused. In psychological terms, this is known as linguistic neutralization. They both describe the absence of sound, not the act that led to it. The words strip emotion from the event, replacing fear and chaos with sensory detachment. Instead of expressing panic, they describe the physics of quiet, measured, distant, almost serene. It is an unconscious metaphor for what may have happened inside the house that morning, a sudden, devastating stillness following conflict or noise. Even more revealing is what's missing from their language: fear words. Neither Daniel nor Malaya ever used expressions like terrified, desperate, afraid, or panic. Their vocabulary belonged not to emotion, but to observation, noticed, surveyed, hope. The verbs describe cognition, not sensation. When people recount genuine trauma, they default to emotional language because memory encodes feeling before fact. Here, the inverse occurred. Their words operated as rational explanations, as though the speakers were narrators rather than participants. In trauma linguistics, this pattern is common among individuals attempting to maintain control, what experts call an emotional control narrative. The speaker unconsciously translates chaos into structure to prevent psychological collapse. Every, noticed, replaces, felt. Every, surveyed, replaces, searched. Every, hope, replaces, fear. By turning their emotions into logic, they rewrite their own minds, reducing unbearable uncertainty into something that can be recited without breaking. The effect is eerie. Their stories sound believable but sterile, coordinated yet lifeless. Each phrase seems carefully placed to sound cooperative, yet the absence of chaos makes them unbelievable. True grief is rarely composed, it stumbles, repeats, contradicts itself. Their symmetry, their mutual phrasing, betrayed that something deeper had been curated. Daniel's tone was mechanical, and Malaya's was subdued, but the words flowed from the same source, the need to appear rational. In doing so, they stripped their statements of human warmth. Together, they built a verbal fortress of calm, one that might shield them from investigators, from judgment, or perhaps from the guilt that hovered between them. In the end, their language told the story. Their faces tried to hide a duet of controlled voices speaking from within silence. The sound of children playing was replaced by the precision of adults explaining. Where there should have been emotion, there was order. Where there should have been panic, there was grammar. And in that carefully constructed quiet, the truth of what happened to Lily and Jack began to disappear, just like the sound that morning when, as they both said, it was quiet. By the end of the summer, the partnership between Daniel Martell and Malaya Brooks Murray had fractured completely. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police confirmed that Malaya had left Daniel's home and was living elsewhere with their infant daughter, under quiet supervision. After that, she disappeared not only from the investigation's timeline, but from public life altogether. There were no more interviews, no statements, no pleas. Her absence became another layer of silence in a case already defined by it. Daniel, however, remained visible. In late September, standing before the same house from which Lily and Jack had vanished, he faced the camera once more. His voice was steady, his chin raised slightly toward the lens. "Every day is a new day, new hope," he said. He repeated the word hope several times, weaving it through nearly every sentence that followed. Hope for answers. Hope for closure. Hope for peace. But to anyone familiar with his earlier interviews, the tone hadn't changed. It wasn't the trembling optimism of a grieving parent, it was a slogan, rehearsed and hollow. Behavioral analysts called it a mantra defense mechanism, the repetitive use of a comforting word to fill the emotional vacuum left by guilt, uncertainty, or fear. Hope, for Daniel, had become both shield and sedative. It gave him something to say when silence might sound incriminating. Each repetition was a small act of control, a verbal loop that prevented emotion from breaching the surface. True hope is open-ended, it trembles with risk. Daniel's version was sealed tight, confident, unyielding. It functioned less as faith and more as denial. By contrast, Malaya's disappearance from the media told an entirely different story. Her silence was not composure, it was collapse. Those who had seen her in the weeks before she vanished from public view recalled a woman pale and trembling, voice barely audible. Her eyes rarely lifted. When she spoke, her sentences meandered, contradicting themselves. The woman who once sat beside Daniel, nodding obediently, had faded into a whisper. If Daniel embodied the external facade of strength, Malaya reflected its cost. Their divergence, his visibility versus her retreat, revealed the psychological split between them. Analysts studying their footage placed their behaviors side by side, comparing gestures, tone, and gaze. The contrast was startling. In terms of eye contact, Malaya avoids the lens, glancing down or to the left when emotional, while Daniel maintains direct eye contact and rarely blinks. Regarding language, Malaya is emotional, hesitant, and contradictory, whereas Daniel is logical, concise, and tightly controlled. In posture, Malaya appears closed with shoulders slumped and hands clasped near her chest, while Daniel's posture is open, with loose arms, chest forward, and a tendency to occupy the frame. From these traits, psychologists derived two opposing internal states. Malaya represented internal collapse of fear, guilt, and possibly the residue of control from an unequal relationship. Her gestures, the self-touching, the thumb pressed into her palm, the constant neck protection were all indicators of someone retreating inward, seeking safety within herself because none existed around her. Daniel, meanwhile, displayed external control and insistence on composure, dominance, and rationality. His posture expanded outward, claiming authority not only in the conversation, but in the narrative of the case itself. When viewed through this lens, their public personas became mirror images of a single dynamic power and submission. For months, Malaya had seemed to echo Daniel's version of events, repeating phrases like, "We woke up," "We noticed," "We searched." Her language fused with his until it was impossible to separate one voice from the other. Once she left him, the echo stopped. Silence replaced the joint narrative, and Daniel filled the vacuum alone. His appearances multiplied. He gave structured interviews, spoke about procedures, discussed police methods, and insisted on his innocence, all while using hope as punctuation. Observers noticed how his demeanor changed subtly after Malaya's departure. Without her beside him, Daniel became more expansive. In group shots, he positioned himself at the center. His hands, once folded between his knees, now gestured outward. His arms spread when addressing cameras, and his feet planted firmly apart. This territorial stance, known in nonverbal analysis as power, posing signals an effort to dominate both physical and psychological space. For Daniel, this was not grief expressed outward, it was control projected outward. In one follow-up interview, his language bordered on sermon, like, "Hope is all we have. Hope keeps me going. Hope is what this world needs." The repetition stripped the word of meaning, turning it into rhythm. Each time he said hope, his head nodded slightly, reinforcing belief through movement. Yet his eyes stayed fixed and unblinking. In his mouth, hope no longer meant yearning, it became command. He was no longer pleading for his children's return. He was asserting control over the narrative of loss itself. Psychologists have long noted this phenomenon in cases where one partner controls or dominates another. The dominant figure externalizes emotion, turning vulnerability into authority, while the submissive partner internalizes it, experiencing guilt, confusion, and paralysis. Malaya's silence following her departure can be read as the aftermath of long-term coercive control. When someone accustomed to being directed suddenly gains distance, speech often disappears. Silence becomes recovery. Her withdrawal was not avoidance, it was survival. Daniel's continued media presence, conversely, functioned as image management. His calculated calmness, the perfect phrasing, the tidy composure, these were not random. They built the portrait of a man still in charge, the pillar of hope, standing against doubt. Yet the irony was cruel. In trying to project strength, he revealed isolation. Without Malaya's quiet validation beside him, his calm no longer looked unified, it looked staged. The partnership that once created an illusion of solidarity now exposed its true structure. Their differences extended beyond behavior into philosophy. Malaya's language, however fractured, still carried emotion. When she said, "I want them home," she meant them. Daniel's language centered on himself, his hope, his patience, his frustration with the investigation. Her sorrow felt involuntary, his serenity felt manufactured. Together, they formed a binary of survival mechanisms, one retreating inward to hide from pain, the other expanding outward to control it. This psychological polarity, internal collapse versus external control, offers a chilling symmetry. Each strategy served the same purpose: to endure unbearable guilt or uncertainty. Malaya sought safety in silence, Daniel in speech. One diminished her presence, the other amplified his. Both, however, were mechanisms of self-preservation, not unity. When the behavior panel reviewed their final public appearances, one analyst summarized the divide in a single sentence: "Their silence isn't unity, it's survival." It was not the shared quiet of partners enduring tragedy together. It was the fragmented silence of two people managing fear in opposite directions. Malaya's silence spoke of withdrawal, Perhaps from control, perhaps from shame. Daniel's voice filled the space she left behind, but each word of hope only deepened the chasm between sincerity and performance. In the psychology of trauma, silence and repetition can both be screams. The difference lies only in where the pain lives. By autumn, the image of the once united couple had dissolved. One vanished into obscurity, the other stood before cameras, reciting hope like prayer. Their eyes no longer met, their stories no longer merged. And in that final split, the world saw not a shared tragedy, but a mirror broken down the middle, one side shrinking from the truth, the other speaking over it. Their silence was never about solidarity. It was about survival. When the story of Lily and Jack Sullivan first spread through Nova Scotia, it wasn't just a tragedy, it became a mirror for a deeper national wound. The missing children were not only the focus of one family's mystery, but of a community that had seen this pattern before. Among the Mi'kmaq people, to whom their mother, Malaya Brooks Murray, belongs, the disappearance of children carried a heavy echo of history. At a community vigil, one elder voiced what many were thinking. He said quietly, "Our people used to hide our children to keep them safe from the system." The statement rippled through the gathering. To outsiders, it might have sounded cryptic, even defensive. But to those who understood the legacy of Canada's Indigenous policies, the residential schools, the 60s scoop, and the ongoing overreach of CPS, it was painfully clear. The elder wasn't excusing anyone. He was invoking memory. The instinct of survival inherited by generations who had seen their children taken for their own good and never returned. In that light, some began to wonder if Malaya's silence, and even her erratic behavior, might not stem from guilt but from fear of a system that had never protected her people. Could it be possible, they asked, that she had hidden her children, or handed them to relatives, to shield them from CPS intervention? The speculation gained traction online, where community members pointed out that Lily and Jack had been homeschooled and rarely seen outside the family property. It wasn't proof, but it resonated with a long-standing pattern. Indigenous families living in quiet distrust of government oversight. Yet, whatever the truth, public anger turned swiftly toward the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Within days of the disappearance, the RCMP's conduct had become its own controversy. First, there was no Amber Alert. Despite 2 small children missing under unexplained circumstances, the force said the case did not meet the criteria because there was no evidence of abduction. To the Mi'kmaq community, and to many Canadians watching, that reasoning sounded hollow. How could there be evidence of abduction when the children had simply vanished? The Amber Alert, they argued, was not only for confirmed kidnappings, it was for missing children in danger. The omission felt like a dismissal. Then came the abrupt end of the search. After only 5 days of ground and air efforts, RCMP scaled back operations, saying there was no indication. The children were still in the area. For local residents, that was incomprehensible. The surrounding terrain was dense and unforgiving. 5 days could barely scratch its surface. Volunteers had been ready to continue, but official coordination stopped. Once again, the Indigenous families of Nova Scotia watched the system disengage just when it was needed most. The pattern was familiar. Activists compared the case to the disappearance and murder of Tanya Brooks, 2009, a Mi'kmaq woman whose case went unsolved for years, and to the brutal killing of Helen Betty Osborne, 1971, in Manitoba, whose murderers remained free for more than a decade. In both instances, law enforcement was accused of indifference and bias toward Indigenous victims. Each time, the official posture had been the same: polite, procedural, and detached. The community called it bureaucratic empathy, a version of care that looks like concern on paper, but feels like abandonment in practice. When journalists pressed the RCMP for comment on the Amber Alert decision, the spokesperson's tone was clinical. "We follow established criteria," she said. "In this case, the information available did not meet the necessary threshold." The phrasing could have come from any number of government press releases across the years. It was factual, non-committal, and emotionally sterile. To the Mi'kmaq audience, it sounded less like professionalism and more like the voice of a system protecting itself. Sociologists studying crisis communication later described the RCMP's posture as a kind of collective body language. In their reports, they used the same vocabulary behavioral experts had applied to Daniel Martell. The institution, like Daniel, projected neutrality, procedure, and control. There was no trembling, no visible urgency, no raw empathy, only statements of process and precision. The systemic demeanor mirrored Daniel's composure, in his interviews calm to the point of coldness, rational to the point of distance. This collective detachment, the government's version of emotional suppression, had a predictable psychological effect. It created what trauma experts call secondary abandonment, the feeling that institutions, meant to protect, are now indifferent to pain. For indigenous communities, that feeling wasn't new. It had been passed down from residential school survivors who remembered watching police remove children from homes without consent. The RCMP's procedural calm reopened those scars. It didn't matter that the officers on the ground might have cared. What mattered was the absence of visible urgency. The impact was swift. Trust in law enforcement eroded even further. Online, hashtags demanding accountability spread through Mi'kmaq networks and beyond. Effect justice for Lily and Jack, Amber for all, fast stop Thessalons. Local leaders condemned the RCMP for what they called performative search efforts, operations that looked diligent for cameras but ended before producing results. By mid-summer, grassroots volunteers had organized their own search teams, walking trails, checking culverts, and canvassing back roads without police oversight. In Stellarton, a group of Mi'kmaq youth established a command tent called the Circle, dedicated to gathering tips and sharing updates that official channels ignored. These volunteer efforts were more than symbolic. They were acts of reclamation, reasserting community agency where the system had failed. If they won't look, we will, one organizer told a reporter. Their persistence highlighted a painful irony. The people most traumatized by historic policing were now forced to perform the work of the police themselves. As months passed with no answers, the discrepancy in tone between the community and the authorities grew impossible to ignore. Where Mi'kmaq families prayed, shouted, and wept openly, RCMP representatives remained uniformly composed. Where volunteers lit candles and chanted the children's names, press officers read bullet points from prepared statements. The contrast was not just cultural, it was existential. The community embodied grief as movement. The institution embodied grief as protocol. For many observers, the body language of the system, hands behind backs, eyes steady, voices firm, was indistinguishable from Daniel's own demeanor in front of the cameras. The RCMP's neutral professionalism and Daniel's detached certainty reflected the same psychological posture, control through suppression. Both presented calmness as competence, but to those in pain, it registered as indifference. By early autumn, the emotional divide had hardened into cynicism. People in Pictou County stopped expecting updates. The RCMP briefings grew shorter. When the Cadaver dogs returned in September, few locals believed the effort would bring closure. Instead, they saw it as a gesture to restore credibility, not to find truth. The system's calm had become its own confession. We don't feel what you feel. In Mi'kmaq culture, silence can be sacred, a form of respect, of listening. But the silence of the institutions, like Daniel's silence before reporters, was something else entirely. It was the quiet of disengagement, the stillness of procedure replacing compassion. In both, the same message echoed beneath the surface. We're in control. We decide when to stop caring. And so, as official efforts waned, the people who had been told their children mattered least refused to stop searching. They carried flashlights into the woods and hope into the dark. They searched not only for Lily and Jack, but for the piece of faith in justice that Canada had taken from them long ago. In the end, the disappearance of two Mi'kmaq children became more than a local tragedy. It became an X-ray of a nation's conscience. The body language of the system, like Daniel's, was precise, measured, and calm. But in that calm, the community saw what they had always seen: not safety, but distance; not order, but indifference. And from that realization came a grim clarity. The search for Lily and Jack Sullivan was no longer just about two missing children. It was about finding something far harder to recover: the belief that someone somewhere would still come when they called for help. In the end, what remains of the Lily and Jack Sullivan case is not only the mystery of their disappearance, but the two people left behind standing on opposite sides of the same silence. Their final words, captured in separate interviews months apart, became the mirror through which the public could see the full psychological divide between them. Daniel Martell's last recorded statement was defiant and calculated. Looking directly into the camera, voice flat and unwavering, he said, "We didn't kill the kids." No one had asked him that question at the time. There was no accusation, no confrontation. Yet he brought it forward himself, preemptively answering a doubt that lived inside him more than in the public. The phrasing was deliberate, wit, not I. Even in denial, he bound himself to Malaya, tethering her presence to his own defense. It was the language of rational denial, cold, structured, built like a wall. His tone carried no tremor. His breathing stayed even. He was not trying to convince others, he was trying to convince himself. Malaya's last known words, recorded weeks earlier, were soft and fragile. "I don't want to go through another night without them," she said, her head bowed, voice quivering under exhaustion. The line was almost a whisper, half confession, half prayer. Unlike Daniel's statement, it was not a defense, it was despair. Her denial lived not in logic but in fear, as if saying the words, "without them," could undo reality. Where Daniel built distance, Malaya clung to longing. Both were denying the same truth, but from different emotional poles, one through control, the other through collapse. The behavior panel, after reviewing hours of footage from both, summarized it in one of their most quoted lines. One of them is managing perception. The other is managing pain. Daniel, they argued, was consumed with appearance, how he looked, how he sounded, how he could maintain authority amid suspicion. Malaya, by contrast, was consumed by emotion, how to keep herself from breaking entirely. In psychological terms, these are dual defense systems, cognitive denial versus emotional denial. They serve the same function, survival, but manifest in opposite directions. The contrast between them could not have been starker. Daniel's body remained a fortress, shoulders squared, spine straight, eyes forward. His diction was mechanical, his tone rehearsed. Even his moments of supposed vulnerability, like when he repeated, "hope," in later interviews felt like scripts, phrases worn down by repetition. Malaya's body told another story. Her shoulders curved inward, her gaze averted downward, her voice fractured mid-sentence. She looked smaller each time she appeared, as if the weight of her silence was folding her in. He projected control, she radiated fear. Together, they created a tableau of contradiction, two halves of denial locked in a dance neither could end. For Daniel, the silence was armor. For Malaya, it was isolation. His words sought to manage narrative, hers sought to manage survival. When paired side by side, their interviews almost play like opposing ends of the same sentence. "We didn't kill the kids, I can't live without them." He negates responsibility, she negates reality. Both sentences, in their own ways, protect the speaker from collapse. In trauma psychology, denial is not always deception, it is sometimes preservation. The human mind can only carry so much grief, guilt, or terror before it fractures. Daniel and Malaya each found their own form of refuge. His was in logic, long sentences, technical details, timelines, and polygraph references. Hers was in emotion-broken phrases, trembling pauses, and wishful tenses. One constructed walls with words, the other built cages out of silence. Neither could face the full magnitude of what had happened, or what might have happened in that house on Gerlach Road. By late 2025, their worlds no longer overlapped. Daniel continued to speak, to perform the role of the rational survivor. Malaya vanished from view entirely. Yet even apart, their silence echoed the same haunting truth: the human body cannot hide what the mouth refuses to say. Analysts revisiting the footage noticed how Daniel's micro-expressions betrayed tension under his control. Each time he asserted innocence. "We didn't do anything. They won't find anything." His upper lip tightened. His nostrils flared slightly. These involuntary cues, known as leakage signals, often surface when emotional conflict collides with cognitive certainty. Malaya, in contrast, leaked emotion through her hands, fingers twitching, thumb tucked inward. Constant self-soothing gestures. Where his denial lived in his jaw, hers lived in her pulse. The silence between them, then, was not simply absence of words, it was the space between two incompatible truths. Daniel's truth was structural. Control the story, control the outcome. Malaya's truth was emotional, survive the story, even if it breaks you. Neither had room for grief, because grief demands surrender. And surrender, in both of their worlds, meant collapse. When viewed as a single psychological portrait, their relationship became a study in dual defense. Daniel's external control and Malaya's internal collapse formed the perfect mechanism for avoidance. He externalized guilt, deflecting it through logic and appearance. She internalized it, absorbing it through shame and silence. Together, they maintained the illusion of composure, while quietly disintegrating beneath it. It is this dynamic that haunted investigators and observers alike. Even as months passed, as the searches waned and the media cycle shifted, people couldn't forget their words. We didn't kill the kids. I don't want to go through another night without them. One statement froze time, the other begged for it to reverse. One closed the door, the other knocked on it endlessly. And in between those two sentences, the truth continued to vanish somewhere between denial and despair. The tragedy of the Sullivan case is not only that two children disappeared, but that the adults left behind became symbols of two ways the human mind resists unbearable reality. Daniel's calmness was his weapon, Malaya's silence was her wound. They were mirror images of survival, each reflecting what the other could not admit. His voice said, "I am in control." Her body said, "I am afraid." Together, they created a silence so thick that even truth could not pass through. And so, the investigation remains open. The RCMP has never confirmed what happened to Lily and Jack. No remains have been identified, no charges filed. The file sits in bureaucratic limbo, alive, but not moving. The silence of the case mirrors the silence of its witnesses. Yet, for those who have studied their words and watched their faces, the evidence is not only in documents or timelines, it is in posture, in breath, in tone. As one analyst put it, no one can lie with their shoulders or hide guilt in their hands. The human body, no matter how disciplined, betrays its truths in motion. Daniel and Malaya spoke dozens of sentences, but their bodies spoke louder, one controlled, one coward. Between them stood a void filled with what neither could bear to name. The story of Lily and Jack Sullivan ends, for now, not with revelation, but with a haunting equilibrium, a silence that speaks louder than confession. The truth remains buried, perhaps with the children themselves, perhaps within the people who last saw them alive. If you know something about Lily and Jack Sullivan, contact the Nova Scotia RCMP or Canada's Missing Program. Because until someone breaks that silence, the truth will remain exactly where it has been all along, between them.